What happens when a genetically enhanced super soldier becomes too dangerous for her own people to control? When the galaxy's most feared commander discovers that her greatest enemy isn't an alien invasion or a cosmic war, but the crushing weight of absolute isolation. This is the story of Commander Serah, who was built to be the perfect weapon until two humans showed her something her creators never intended her to learn. Sometimes the most formidable warriors aren't the ones who fight alone. The void screamed with plasma fire as Commander Serah's flagship carved through space, enemy vessels swarming like angry hornets around a giant. Her 8-foot frame dominated the bridge obsidian skin gleaming under the red alert lights, every muscle coiled with lethal precision. "Evasive pattern Zeta 7, she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The ship lurched violently as another volley barely missed their hull. Through the viewport, three enemy cruisers closed in fast, their weapons charging for what would surely be a killing blow. But here's the thing about Commander Serah that made her legendary across 12 star systems. She wasn't just tall, wasn't just intimidating. She was something else entirely. 23 years ago, when the Kytherian Empire faced extinction, their top geneticists made a desperate choice. They took their most promising soldiers and rewrote their DNA splicing and genes from apex predators across the galaxy. Enhanced reflexes, titanium-dense bones, a nervous system that could process combat data faster than most ship computers. They created the perfect warrior. What they didn't expect was creating something their own people would come to fear. Serah's fingers danced across the tactical display with inhuman speed. Target their engine clusters. Full spread, maximum yield. The weapons officer hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but that hesitation spoke volumes. Even her own crew sometimes forgot she was still one of them. The enemy ships never saw it coming. In a maneuver that defied conventional tactics, Serah's flagship spun on its axis, presenting its heaviest armor to incoming fire while unleashing a devastating counterattack. Two enemy vessels exploded in brilliant fireballs. The third limped away, its crew undoubtedly spreading word of the encounter. Another victory for the infamous Commander Serah. Another reminder of why her own people whispered about her in corners. As the bridge crew went about damage control, Serah stood alone at the viewport, watching the debris field drift past. Victory felt hollow when you won it without equals, without anyone who truly understood the weight of command. That's when the message came through. "Commander, we're receiving a priority transmission from Fleet Command. New personnel assignments." Serah turned, her expression unreadable. "Speak." "Two new crew members, ma'am. A mechanic named Eli Torres and a systems specialist, Kai Navarro. Both transferred from the Outer Rim stations." She nodded curtly. "Have them report to their stations immediately." What she didn't know was that one of these men would challenge everything she thought she knew about connection, and the other would be watching her every move with the trained eyes of a Terran intelligence operative. The war had taught the galaxy many things, but it was about to teach Commander Serah something she'd never expected to learn. Sometimes the most dangerous missions aren't the ones that threaten your life. They're the ones that threaten to change who you are. As the two shuttles approached her flagship carrying her new crew members, Serah couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. She was right. She just had no idea how right she was. The universe has a funny way of putting exactly the right people in your path at exactly the right moment, even when you're too formidable for your own kind. The first shuttle docked with barely a whisper against the hull. From it emerged Eli Torres, and if you saw him on any space station from here to Alpha Centauri, you'd peg him as exactly what his papers said he was. A mechanic. Mid-30s, calloused hands, the kind of steady presence that fixed things without making a big deal about it. He carried a single duffel bag and a toolkit that had seen more star systems than most admirals. His eyes swept the docking bay with professional interest, noting stress fractures in the hull, plating the slight vibration in the deck that suggested the port engine needed recalibration. This was a man who understood machines better than most people understood other people. What nobody knew was that Eli Torres had grown up on New Terra's industrial moon, where keeping ancient mining equipment running meant the difference between eating and starving. He'd learned early that panic killed more machinery than wear and tear ever would. Stay calm, think it through, fix what's broken. Simple philosophy, effective results. The second shuttle arrived 3 minutes later. Navarro stepped out, and something about him was different. Not obviously different. You'd have to know what to look for. The way his eyes cataloged exit routes, how he positioned himself to observe without being observed. The fact that his personnel file listed him as a systems specialist, but his hands were too clean for someone who supposedly spent years crawling through ventilation shafts. Because Navarro wasn't just a systems specialist. He was Terran intelligence, and he'd been watching Commander Serah's career with the kind of attention usually reserved for potential threats to galactic stability. The intelligence briefing had been clear. Commander Serah represented something unprecedented, a genetically enhanced super soldier who commanded absolute loyalty from her crews while being simultaneously feared by her own government. The kind of wild card that could shift the balance of power if she ever decided to stop following orders. Kai's mission was simple: observe, report, determine if Commander Serah was an asset or a threat to Terran interests. What his handlers didn't tell him was that some people are impossible to categorize that simply. Meanwhile, 8 decks up in her private quarters, Commander Serah stood before a viewport that showed nothing but empty space. This was her ritual after every battle. Stand alone, process the victory, try to remember what it felt like to celebrate with others. The genetic modifications had given her everything a warrior could want. Strength that could crush steel, reflexes that could track multiple targets simultaneously, a tactical mind that could process battlefield data faster than most computers. But they'd also given her something she hadn't asked for: isolation. When you're designed to be perfect at warfare, regular people start to look fragile. When your nervous system processes information at superhuman speeds, normal conversation feels agonizingly slow. When your very presence reminds people of their own mortality, making friends becomes almost impossible. She tried in the early years, tried to connect with her fellow officers, her crew members, even civilians during shore leave. But there was always that moment, that flicker of fear in their eyes when they really looked at her, when they remembered what she was built to do. 23 years of victories, hundreds of commendations, the respect of every military leader in the Catharian Empire. And at the end of each day, she went to sleep alone, wondering if this was all there would ever be. What Commander Serah didn't know was that her loneliness was about to be challenged by 2 very different men. One who saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than threats to be feared, and another who was professionally trained to see past surfaces to understand what really made people tick. The ship's intercom crackled to life. "Commander Serah to the main engineering bay. New personnel reporting for duty." She straightened her uniform, checked her reflection one more time, and prepared to meet the 2 men who would change everything. Though if you'd told her that at the time, she probably would have laughed. After all, when you're too formidable for your own kind, the last thing you expect is to find your equals among strangers. But the universe, as we're about to see, has a way of surprising even legendary warriors. 3 days into their assignment, something happened that hadn't happened to Commander Serah in over a decade. Someone touched her personal equipment without asking permission. She'd returned to her quarters after the evening briefing to find her combat armor spread across her maintenance bench components, carefully laid out like a surgeon's instruments. The intruder was still there, hunched over her chest plate, with a micro-welder completely absorbed in his work. Most people would have been dead before they could explain themselves. Serah's enhanced reflexes had ended conversations permanently for less than this. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way he worked with the kind of focused precision she recognized from her own combat preparations. Or maybe it was the fact that he hadn't even looked up when she entered. "That's restricted equipment," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made admirals nervous. Eli Torres glanced up, briefly nodded, and returned to his work. "Microfractures in the left shoulder joint. Probably happened during that evasive maneuver 3 days ago. You've been compensating with your right side ever since." The audacity should have been infuriating. Instead, Serah found herself genuinely curious. "How could you possibly know that? Stress patterns in the metal. Plus, I watched you during the crew briefing. Your left shoulder's about 2 degrees lower than normal. Most people wouldn't notice, but armor this advanced responds to minute changes in posture." He set down the welder and finally met her eyes. "Mind if I ask why you haven't had this fixed one good hit to that weak point and you're looking at catastrophic failure?" For a moment, Commander Serah was speechless. Not because of what he'd said, but because of what he hadn't done. He hadn't flinched when she entered, hadn't stammered apologies or backed away from her equipment. He looked directly at her without that telltale flicker of fear she'd grown accustomed to seeing. The repair schedules are backlogged, she said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The real reason was that letting anyone work on her personal gear meant trusting them with her life, and trust was a luxury she'd learned to live without. Eli nodded and resumed his work. Well, you're all set now. I've reinforced the joint with a titanium mesh that should handle anything short of a direct hit from a plasma cannon. He began reassembling the armor with practiced efficiency, though I'd recommend a full diagnostic every 30 days. Equipment this sophisticated needs regular attention. What neither of them noticed was the figure in the corridor outside, partially concealed by the shadows between two wall panels. Kai Navarro had been conducting his own routine maintenance check on the ship's internal sensors when he detected an anomaly in Commander Serah's quarters. His training had taught him to investigate anomalies. What he was witnessing defied everything in Serah's psychological profile. The woman who reportedly maintained emotional distance from everyone was having what appeared to be a normal conversation with the new mechanic. No signs of agitation, no defensive posturing. If anything, she seemed almost relaxed. Kai activated his personal recording device, then immediately deactivated it. Whatever this was, it felt too private to document, too human. Why aren't you afraid of me? Serah asked suddenly, the question surprising even herself. Eli looked up from the armor's power coupling, considering the question seriously. Should I be? You're obviously enhanced, obviously dangerous. But so is a fusion reactor, and I work on those all the time. Respect the power, understand, the systems follow proper procedures. Fear just gets in the way of doing good work. It was such a practical answer, so completely devoid of the usual reverence or terror, that Serah almost laughed. Here was someone who looked at her the same way he looked at complex machinery, something to be understood rather than feared or worshipped. Most people see a weapon when they look at me, she said. I see engineering, Eli replied, checking the armor's diagnostic readings. Really impressive engineering, but still just engineering. Someone took a standard human template and optimized it for specific performance parameters. The craftsmanship is beautiful, but at the end of the day, you're still a person who happens to have some remarkable modifications. In the corridor, Kai felt something shift in his understanding. His mission briefings had painted Commander Serah as either a potential asset to be cultivated or a threat to be neutralized. They'd never considered the possibility that she might simply be someone who'd been carrying the weight of her own legend for too long. There, Eli said, powering down his tools. Good as new, actually better than new. That mesh reinforcement should extend the armor's operational lifespan by about 15%. Serah ran her fingers over the repaired joint, feeling the smooth perfection of the work. When was the last time someone had done something for her without expecting anything in return? When was the last time someone had seen a problem in her life and simply fixed it? Thank you, she said and meant it. As Eli packed up his tools, he paused at the door. Commander, if you need anything else looked at, I'm usually in Engineering Bay 3. Equipment maintenance is what I do, all kinds of equipment. After he left, Serah stood alone in her quarters, staring at her perfectly repaired armor. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about tomorrow's battles or yesterday's victories. She was thinking about microfractures and the man who'd fixed them without being asked. And in the corridor outside, Kai Navarro was beginning to realize that his mission might be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. It started with coffee. The next morning, Commander Serah appeared in Engineering Bay 3, carrying 2 steaming cups and wearing an expression that her crew had never seen before. Uncertainty. I thought you might want some, she said, offering one of the cups to Eli, who was elbow-deep in a power coupling assembly. Eli wiped his hands on a work rag and accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Thanks. Been up since 0400 trying to figure out why the starboard engines are running 3% below optimal efficiency. Any theories? Serah asked, and something in her tone suggested she was genuinely interested in the answer. Could be carbon buildup in the injection manifolds, but I'm thinking it's more likely a calibration drift in the fuel mixture controls. These older ships, they develop personalities over time. You have to learn to speak their language. What struck Eli was how intently she listened. Not the polite attention of a superior officer checking on subordinates, but the focused interest of someone who actually wanted to understand. Most commanders would have asked for a status report and moved on. Serah asked follow-up questions. The coffee visits became a daily routine. 7:30 sharp, 2 cups, 15 minutes of conversation that started with ship maintenance and somehow always wandered into other territory. By the end of the first week, Eli was telling her about the mining colony where he'd grown up, about keeping century-old excavation equipment running with spare parts and determination. "Sounds like you understand pressure," Serah said one morning, watching him recalibrate her sidearms targeting system. "Different kind than yours, I imagine. When I screwed up, machines broke down. When you screw up, people die." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Most people either avoided mentioning the weight of command or spoke about it with reverence they didn't really understand. Eli talked about it like another engineering problem. Complex, high stakes, but ultimately manageable if you had the right approach. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making the right calls," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "You ever been wrong before?" "Of course. Learn from it?" "Yes." "Then you're probably making better calls than someone who's never been wrong." Eli handed back her weapon, perfectly calibrated. Perfection isn't about never making mistakes. It's about making fewer of them tomorrow than you did today. From his station in the adjacent corridor, Kai Navarro documented another deviation from Commander Serah's established behavioral patterns. She was spending increasing amounts of time in non-essential areas of the ship. Her posture during crew briefings had become more relaxed. Yesterday, he'd actually observed her smile during a conversation with the engineering staff. According to her psychological profile, Commander Serah maintained strict professional distance from subordinates, rarely engaged in casual conversation, and showed no interest in personal relationships. The woman he was observing violated every data point in that assessment. More troubling from an intelligence perspective was that these changes seemed to be making her more effective, not less. Crew morale in her sections had improved markedly. Equipment readiness was at an all-time high. Even her tactical decisions during their last training exercise had shown a creativity that hadn't appeared in previous mission reports. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't making her a weaker commander. It was making her a different one. "Tell me about New Terra's industrial moon," Serah said during one of their morning conversations, having brought coffee to Engineering Bay 3 for the 13th consecutive day. Eli looked up from the plasma conduit he was inspecting. "Not much to tell. 40,000 people, mostly miners and support staff. One hospital, 2 schools, 3 bars, and enough heavy machinery to strip mine an asteroid belt." Sounds isolated. It was, but isolation teaches you things, like how to fix problems with whatever's available instead of waiting for the perfect solution. How to trust the people around you, because if you don't, everyone suffers. He paused, studying her face. "I imagine you know something about isolation." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Serah could have deflected it, changed the subject, reasserted the professional distance that had defined her relationships for over 2 decades. Instead, she found herself nodding. "More than I'd like to admit." "Isolation's not always a choice," Eli said quietly. "Sometimes it's imposed by circumstances. Sometimes by other people's expectations. Sometimes by our own fear of what happens if we let people get too close." The conversation was interrupted by the ship's intercom announcing a priority drill, but as they went their separate ways, both carried something new with them. Serah carried the realization that someone might actually understand the weight she'd been carrying alone. And Eli carried the knowledge that beneath all that genetic enhancement and legendary reputation was someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as simply human. In his hidden observation post, Kai Navarro made a decision that would have surprised his handlers at Terran Intelligence. He encrypted his daily report and marked it as routine maintenance updates. No mention of behavioral anomalies, no analysis of potential security implications. For the first time in his career, Agent Kai Navarro was choosing not to report what he observed, and he wasn't entirely sure why. What he did know was that Commander Serah was changing. The question was whether that change represented an opportunity or a threat, and increasingly, Kai was beginning to suspect that the answer might depend entirely on what happened next. 3 weeks into what had become their daily routine, something shifted. The morning coffee had stretched into afternoon equipment checks, and now, for the first time, Commander Serah found herself in Engineering Bay 3 during the night shift. The ship operated on a skeleton crew after 2,200 hours, most sections dimmed to conserve power and allow for maintenance cycles. But Eli was still there, hunched over a diagnostic panel, troubleshooting what appeared to be a minor fluctuation in the artificial gravity grid. "You're working late," Serah observed, settling onto a nearby equipment crate with the kind of casual ease that would have shocked her bridge crew. "Could say the same about you. Don't commanders need sleep?" "Sleep is for people who don't dream about tactical scenarios." She watched him work, noting the methodical way he approached each system check. "What keeps you up?" Eli paused, his hands hovering over the control interface. It was a more personal question than they'd ventured into before, and something in the dimmed lighting and quiet hum of the ship made honesty feel safer. "Guilt mostly," he said finally. "Every time I fix something here, I think about the equipment I couldn't fix back home. The mining rig that collapsed because I missed a stress fracture. The life support system that failed because I was working on something else that seemed more urgent at the time." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared in 3 weeks of careful conversations. "How many people died?" Serah asked quietly. "7 in the mining accident, 3 when the life support failed." Eli's voice was steady, but she could hear the weight behind the words. You'd think after a while the numbers would stop mattering. They don't. What happened next surprised them both. Commander Serah reached out and placed her hand over his, the gesture so natural and spontaneous that neither of them questioned it. Her genetically enhanced skin was warm against his calloused fingers. "I've lost count of mine," she said. "Not because there are too many, but because I stopped letting myself remember their faces. I thought it would make command easier. Instead, it just made me feel like I was losing pieces of myself." 20 feet away, concealed behind a maintenance panel in the adjacent corridor, Kai Navarro watched through a fiber optic surveillance feed and felt something inside his chest tighten uncomfortably. His training had prepared him for many things: infiltration, data gathering, threat assessment, elimination protocols. It hadn't prepared him for witnessing genuine human connection. The woman on his screen bore no resemblance to the cold, calculating super soldier described in his mission briefings. This was someone sharing pain with another person, someone allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way that seemed to transform her from the inside out. "Sometimes I wonder what I would have been if they hadn't changed me," Serah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I'd stayed just human." "You're still human," so Eli said firmly. "Enhanced, modified, and improved maybe, but still human where it matters. How can you be so sure?" "Because humans are the only species that carry guilt over people they couldn't save. The only ones who lose sleep over mistakes they made trying to help others. Machines don't do that. Weapons don't do that. Only humans." Kai watched as something passed between them. In that moment, a recognition that went deeper than words. Commander Serah's legendary composure cracked just enough to reveal the person underneath, and Eli saw her not as a military asset or a genetic miracle, but as someone who'd been carrying unbearable weight alone for far too long. The moment was shattered by the ship's proximity alarm. Both Serah and Eli snapped to attention as emergency lighting bathed the engineering bay in red. Through his surveillance Iranian feed, Kai saw them shift from intimate conversation to professional cooperation in seconds, but something fundamental had changed. "Unidentified vessel approaching from Sector 7, came the announcement over the ship's intercom. "All senior staff to battle stations." As Serah hurried toward the bridge and Eli began emergency power preparations, Kai remained hidden in his observation post, grappling with a realization that threatened everything he thought he knew about his mission. He'd been sent to determine whether Commander Serah was an asset or a threat. But watching her with Eli had revealed a third possibility his handlers had never considered. She wasn't just a super soldier who might be turned to Terran advantage or eliminated as a potential enemy. She was a person who'd been isolated by her own capabilities, who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than a weapon, and who was now remembering what it meant to connect with another human being. The question that haunted Kai, as he watched them disappear down separate corridors, was whether that transformation made her more dangerous or less. And increasingly, he was beginning to realize that the answer might depend entirely on what Terran intelligence planned to do with the information he'd been gathering. For the first time in his career, Agent Kai Navarro found himself hoping he'd never have to find out. Because whatever was happening between Commander Serah and Eli Torres, it was something rare and precious in a galaxy full of conflict. And destroying rare and precious things, Kai was beginning to understand, might be the one mission he couldn't bring himself to complete. The unidentified vessel wasn't alone. As Commander Serah reached the bridge, tactical displays lit up with contact signatures. 6 ships moving in perfect formation bearing the distinctive energy signatures of Vraxian raiders, professional pirates with military-grade equipment and a reputation for taking no prisoners. Battle stations. Serah commanded, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the bridge. All hands to combat positions. This is not a drill. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The woman who'd been sharing quiet confessions in an engineering bay 20 minutes earlier became something else entirely. Her enhanced reflexes kicked in, processing tactical data faster than most computers could compile it. Her genetically modified neural pathways mapped attack vectors, defensive positions, and casualty projections in the time it took her crew to reach their stations. This was what she'd been built for. This was why her own people feared her. Enemy formation suggests a boarding action, reported her tactical officer. They're trying to disable us, not destroy us. They want prisoners, Serah said grimly, or cargo. Either way, they're not getting either. Her fingers danced across the command interface. Eli, I need everything you can give me from the engines. Already on it, Commander, came his voice through the comm system. You'll have full power in 30 seconds. What happened next was why Commander Serah's name was whispered in bars across 12 star systems. She didn't just command the battle, she conducted it like a lethal symphony. Her ship moved through space with impossible grace, weaving between enemy fire while delivering devastating counterattacks with surgical precision. But the Vraxian raiders hadn't survived this long by underestimating their targets. As Serah's ship engaged the main force, a smaller vessel broke formation and moved to flank them. Its sensor array locked onto the ship's weakest point, preparing to deliver a crippling blow. In the depths of the ship, Kai Navarro faced a moment that would define everything that came after. His training screamed at him to maintain cover, to observe and report, to let events unfold without interference. His mission was intelligence gathering, not combat operations. But watching Commander Serah fight with desperate courage to protect her crew, remembering the vulnerability she'd shown just minutes earlier, Kai made a choice that had nothing to do with Terran intelligence protocols. He accessed the ship's external sensor grid through his system's console and fed false targeting data to the flanking Vraxian vessel. To their instruments, it appeared that Serah's ship had shifted position just enough to make their attack ineffective. When they fired, their weapons struck empty space. The confusion lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Serah's gunners found their target, and the flanking vessel erupted in a ball of superheated plasma. The battle raged for another 20 minutes. When it ended, 5 Vraxian ships drifted as expanding debris fields, and the 6th was limping away, its crew undoubtedly spreading word that Commander Serah's reputation was well-deserved. But victory had come at a cost. An enemy torpedo had breached the ship's armor plating near the bridge, and the explosion had thrown Serah against a bulkhead with enough force to crack the reinforced metal. Even her enhanced physiology couldn't completely absorb that kind of impact. She made it to the medical bay under her own power, but barely. By the time Eli arrived, she was sitting on a diagnostic table, trying to convince the medical officer that she didn't need treatment, while blood seeped through her uniform from a dozen lacerations. "You're an idiot," Eli said without preamble, pushing past the medical staff to examine her injuries. "And you're bleeding internally. I can see it in your posture." "I'm fine," Serah insisted, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "You're not fine. You're hurt, and you're scared, and you're trying to maintain command presence, when what you really need is to let someone take care of you for 5 minutes. Eli's hands were gentle as he helped her out of her damaged uniform jacket. "Trust me, I'm good at fixing things that are broken." What neither of them expected was the third voice from the medical bay's entrance. "He's right about the internal bleeding," Kai Navarro said, stepping into the room with a medical scanner in his hands. "Blunt force trauma to the lower left torso. You've got a hairline fracture in 2 ribs and possible damage to your spleen." Serah turned, and for the first time since they'd met, Kai saw the full force of her enhanced awareness focused on him. She took in his medical knowledge, his two clean hands, the way he moved with tactical precision rather than engineering practicality. Systems specialist, she said slowly, recognition dawning in her eyes. Right, and I'm just a genetically modified soldier who happens to command a starship. The medical bay fell silent except for the hum of diagnostic equipment. Eli looked between them, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. Kai Navarro, Kai said formally, inclining his head. Terran intelligence, deep cover operations. I've been monitoring your activities for the past month under direct orders from Central Command. The revelation hit Serah like a physical blow. She'd opened herself up to these two men's shared vulnerabilities. She'd kept hidden for decades, allowed herself to hope that maybe she'd found people who saw her as more than a weapon. And one of them had been watching her, cataloging her weaknesses, reporting back to handlers who viewed her as either an asset to be exploited or a threat to be eliminated. How long, she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Since the day I came aboard. But Commander, you need to understand, get out. The words carried the full weight of her genetic enhancements, the authority of someone built to command armies. Both of you, get out. Eli started to protest, but Kai caught his arm. She needs time to process this, and she needs medical attention whether she admits it or not. As they left the medical bay, Serah sat alone, bleeding and betrayed, wondering if she'd ever really known either of them at all. The isolation she'd worked so hard to escape had just crashed back down around her, heavier than ever. But outside in the corridor, Agent Kai Navarro was making another decision that would have surprised his handlers. He was going to tell her the truth. All of it. Even the parts that might get him killed. The message from the Kytherian War Council arrived 18 hours after the battle, transmitted on a priority channel that bypassed normal ship communications. Commander Serah read it alone in her quarters, her enhanced vision allowing her to process the encrypted text faster than most people could scan headlines. The contents were blunt, efficient, and utterly predictable. Effective immediately, you will terminate all personal relationships with non-essential personnel. Recent behavioral modifications have been noted and flagged as potential security compromises. Additionally, the Terran intelligence operative aboard your vessel represents an unacceptable risk and will be eliminated at your earliest convenience. Serah read the message 3 times each pass, revealing new layers of bureaucratic coldness. Her own government had been watching her just as closely as Kai had, cataloging her interactions, measuring her humanity like a potential infection to be contained. The door chimed, and she knew without looking who it would be. She'd been avoiding both Eli and Kai for the past day, but some conversations couldn't be postponed forever. Come in. Both men entered together, which surprised her. Eli looked tired, worried, and determined. Kai looked like a man preparing for execution, which wasn't far from the truth. Commander, Kai began formally. I need to explain and know. Serah's voice cut through his words like a blade. You need to listen, both of you. She held up the message tablet. My government wants me to kill you, Kai, and they want me to stop talking to you, Eli. Apparently, developing personal relationships makes me a security risk. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Eli broke it first. What are you going to do? It was the question that had been tearing at her for the past 18 hours. The safe answer, the one that preserved her career and maintained her standing with the War Council, was obvious. Follow orders, eliminate the spy, distance herself from emotional complications, return to the isolated perfection that had defined her existence for over 2 decades. Instead, she looked at both men and said something that would have shocked her younger self. I'm going to refuse. Kai's eyes widened. Commander, you don't understand the implications. I understand them perfectly. I understand that for 23 years, I've been exactly what they wanted me to be. The perfect weapon, the ideal soldier. Emotionally detached, professionally focused, personally isolated. She stood pacing to the viewport that showed the stars beyond. And I understand that for the first time in my adult life, I've remembered what it feels like to be human. Serah, Eli said quietly, using her first name for the first time, they'll come after you. Let them come. She turned back to face them both. Eli, you've shown me that strength doesn't have to mean solitude. That being enhanced doesn't make me less human, just differently human. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. She shifted her attention to Kai. And you. Yes, you lied about who you were. Yes, you were sent to spy on me. But when it mattered, when the choice was between your mission and my life, you chose to save me. That tells me more about who you really are than any intelligence briefing ever could. Kai's voice was barely above a whisper. I was supposed to determine if you were an asset or a threat. My handlers never considered that you might be something else entirely. What's that? A person worth protecting. The ship's proximity alarm chose that moment to sound, followed immediately by the communications officer's voice over the intercom. Commander Serah to the bridge immediately. We have 3 Catherian enforcement vessels approaching on an intercept course. The 3 of them exchanged looks that communicated more than words could. The War Council hadn't waited for her response to their ultimatum. They decided to handle the situation themselves. How long do we have? Serah asked as they hurried toward the bridge. Based on their approach vector, maybe 30 minutes, Kai replied, his intelligence training automatically calculating tactical possibilities. Can we outrun them? Eli asked. Not with the damage we took in the last battle, Serah said grimly. And even if we could, they'd just send more ships. The War Council doesn't like being told no. They reached the bridge to find organized chaos. Her crew was preparing for what they assumed would be a routine inspection by enforcement vessels. They had no idea they were about to become accessories to what the War Council would undoubtedly classify as treason. Serah took her position at the command station, but before she gave any orders, she turned to address the entire bridge crew. In approximately 25 minutes, we're going to be boarded by Catherian enforcement. They're not here for inspection. They're here to arrest me for refusing direct orders and possibly to eliminate crew members they consider security risks. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Anyone who wants to transfer to the enforcement vessels when they arrive is free to do so. No questions asked, no repercussions. The bridge fell silent. Then her tactical officer spoke up. Where are you planning to go, Commander? I don't know yet, but wherever it is it'll be, as free citizens, not as weapons pointed by people who have forgotten what we're supposed to be fighting for. One by one, every officer on the bridge nodded their agreement. Whatever came next, they were committed to facing it together. As the enforcement vessels closed in, Commander Serah realized that she'd made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She'd chosen humanity over duty, connection over isolation, and the uncertain future over the predictable past. The only question now was whether that choice would get everyone she cared about killed. The enforcement vessels didn't bother with standard hailing protocols. They simply opened fire. The first salvo caught Serah's ship off guard, plasma bolts raking across the hull, plating with devastating precision. These weren't raiders or pirates. These were military vessels crewed by people who knew exactly how her ship was constructed, exactly where its weak points were, and exactly how to exploit them. Shields at 60% and falling, reported the tactical officer, his voice tight with controlled fear. They're targeting our engines. Commander Serah gripped her command chair as another volley shook the ship. Her enhanced reflexes were already calculating trajectories, mapping defensive patterns, searching for tactical advantages that simply didn't exist. 3 enforcement vessels against 1 damaged cruiser. The math was brutal and unforgiving. That's when Eli's voice crackled over the comm system from engineering. Serah, I need 2 minutes to reroute power from non-essential systems. Can you buy me that time? We'll get you 2 minutes, she replied, then opened a channel that connected all 3 of them. Kai, I need to know everything you know about enforcement vessel tactics. Everything. From his position at a secondary tactical station, Kai's fingers flew over the interface, pulling up intelligence files he'd memorized during his training. Standard formation Delta 7. Lead vessel draws fire while the other 2 flank from above and below. But there's a weakness. They rely on coordinated targeting data from the lead ship. If we can disrupt their communication array... Can you do it? Serah interrupted, executing a rolling maneuver that barely avoided a concentrated barrage from all 3 attackers. Give me access to our sensor array in 30 seconds. What happened next was something none of them had planned, but all of them understood instinctively. 3 people working in perfect synchronization became something greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. Serah's genetically enhanced mind processed the tactical situation with inhuman speed, finding patterns in the enemy's attack formation that most commanders would have missed. Her ship danced through space with impossible grace, weaving between plasma bolts and missile salvos while positioning itself for the counterattack that would come. In engineering, Eli's hands moved like a concert pianist's, rerouting power conduits and bypassing damaged systems with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from decades of keeping broken things running. He fed every available watt of energy to the weapons and shields, then found more power in systems that weren't supposed to have any to spare. At his makeshift intelligence station, Kai deployed skills that technically didn't exist in his official personnel file. He hacked into the enforcement vessel's communication network, not to shut it down entirely, but to introduce subtle delays and false data that would throw off their coordinated attacks by fractions of seconds. Now, Serah announced, and her ship executed a maneuver that defied conventional tactical doctrine. Instead of trying to escape the enforcement formation, she drove straight into the center of it. The lead enforcement vessel never saw it coming. Serah's ship passed close enough to scrape paint weapons firing at point-blank range. The enforcement vessel's shields collapsed, and its hull began venting atmosphere. "One down," Eli reported from engineering, "but we just burned out half our power couplers with that stunt." The remaining two enforcement vessels adjusted their tactics instantly, closing in from opposite directions to prevent another close approach attack. But Kai had been monitoring their communications, and he'd noticed something. "They're not trying to destroy us," he announced. "They have orders to disable and board. That means they won't use their heaviest weapons." "But we will," Serah said grimly, and targeted the second enforcement vessel's engine array with everything they had left. The battle that followed lasted only 8 minutes, but it felt like hours. Serah commanded the ship with the kind of tactical brilliance that had made her legendary, while Eli kept their damaged systems running through pure determination and engineering genius. Kai fed them intelligence updates and electronic warfare support that turned the tide at crucial moments. When the second enforcement vessel exploded in a brilliant fireball, the third one immediately began broadcasting surrender signals. "Unknown vessel, this is Captain Zeras of the Enforcement Division. We yield, requesting permission to withdraw." Serah considered letting them go, but Kai shook his head. "They'll report our position and tactics to the War Council. We'll have a fleet after us within days." Instead, Serah opened a general broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Commander Serah to all enforcement personnel. Your orders were to arrest me for refusing to eliminate crew members and terminate personal relationships. I'm hereby notifying all Catherian military forces that I reject the authority of a government that treats its own soldiers as disposable weapons, rather than sentient beings worthy of respect." She paused, knowing that her next words would be recorded and transmitted across the galaxy. "Any enforcement personnel who wish to join us in establishing an independent military organization dedicated to protecting civilians rather than serving political interests are welcome aboard. Any who wish to return to Catherian space are free to leave in the remaining enforcement vessel." The response surprised everyone. Within an hour, 47 enforcement personnel had requested transfer to Serah's ship. Only 12 chose to return home. As the lone enforcement vessel limped away toward Catherian space, Serah stood on her bridge flanked by Eli and Kai, looking out at stars that suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. "So what do we do now?" Eli asked. "Now," Serah said, "we find out what happens when people choose to work together instead of being commanded to fight apart." The triad alliance that had won them the battle was about to become something much larger. Something that would challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about military hierarchy, genetic enhancement, and the power of human connection. But that's a story for what comes next. 6 months later, in the neutral zone between Catherian and Terran space, something unprecedented was taking shape. The Galactic Mediator Syndicate operated out of a converted mining station that had been abandoned for over a decade. What had once been a corporate extraction facility was now headquarters to the most unusual military organization the galaxy had ever seen. Commander Serah stood in what used to be the station's main ore processing center, now converted into a tactical planning room. Holographic displays showed shipping lanes, conflict zones, and diplomatic flashpoints across 3 sectors. But this wasn't the kind of tactical planning she'd grown up with. This was something entirely different. "We've got a situation developing in the Outer Rim," Kai announced, entering the room with a datapad in his hands. "2 cargo convoys got hit by raiders last week. The local authorities are requesting escort services." Eli looked up from the engine schematic he'd been studying. What kind of raiders? Professional pirates or desperate refugees? That's the question, isn't it? Serah said, accepting the datapad from Kai. 6 months ago, I would have been given orders to eliminate all threats. Now we get to ask why they're threatening people in the first place. The Galactic Mediator Syndicate had started as a simple concept. What if military force was used to solve problems instead of just destroying them? What if conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than overwhelming firepower? What if genetic enhancement and advanced technology were applied to building peace instead of winning wars? The concept had attracted attention from some very unexpected sources. The Andromedan refugees have agreed to our terms, Kai reported, scrolling through his intelligence briefings. They'll provide technical support and advanced sensors in exchange for protection during their migration to the Helios sector. And the Centauri mining guilds, Serah asked. They want to hire us for escort duty, but they also want to discuss long-term security arrangements for their outer colonies. Apparently, word is spreading that we're good at keeping people alive instead of just killing their enemies. Eli grinned. Imagine that. People like military forces that actually protect them. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Serah had been designed to be the perfect soldier, Kai had been trained to be the perfect spy, and Eli had been shaped by circumstances to be the perfect survivor. Together, they created something that none of their original purposes had anticipated. Speaking of protection, Kai continued, we've got 3 new applicants for crew positions. 2 former Terran intelligence operatives who want out of the shadow war business, and 1 former Catherian enhancement specialist who's tired of building weapons out of people. Serah studied the personnel files on her display. What do you think? I think people are hungry for alternatives, Kai said. Military organizations that don't treat soldiers as expendable resources. Intelligence agencies that don't sacrifice operatives for political convenience. Research facilities that don't turn people into tools. And what about us? Eli asked, gesturing to encompass the 3 of them. What are we becoming? It was a question they'd been asking themselves since the day they'd decided to refuse their original orders. Serah wasn't just a commander anymore. She was a leader who had to balance tactical necessity with moral responsibility. Kai wasn't just a spy. He was an intelligence coordinator who had to weigh the value of secrets against the cost of keeping them. Eli wasn't just a mechanic. He was a systems architect who had to consider the human elements of every machine he maintained. We're becoming something new, Serah said finally, something that doesn't fit the old categories. Their conversation was interrupted by the station's communication system. Priority message from the Vegan Diplomatic Corps. They're requesting mediation services for a border dispute with the Rigel Confederation. The 3 of them exchanged glances. 6 months ago, the idea of genetically enhanced super soldiers serving as diplomatic mediators would have been absurd. Now it was just another Tuesday. Accept the contract, Serah decided, but make sure they understand our terms. We don't take sides. We find solutions. And if there isn't a solution both sides can accept, Kai asked, then we help them find one they can live with, Eli said. That's what we do now. We help those people figure out how to live with each other instead of kill each other. As they prepared to take on their next mission, Serah reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when Eli had brought her coffee in Engineering Bay 3. She'd been a weapon, then pointed by others at targets she'd never chosen. Now she was something else entirely. She was free. They all were. Free to choose their battles, free to decide what they stood for, free to build something that had never existed before. The Galactic Mediator Syndicate was growing, not just in size but in influence. Other military units were beginning to ask questions about their own orders. Intelligence agencies were losing operatives who wanted to serve causes larger than political convenience. Research facilities were facing resignations from scientists who wanted to create instead of destroy. Change was spreading one choice at a time, one person at a time, one mission at a time. And at the center of it all were 3 people who discovered that the most powerful weapon in the galaxy wasn't genetic enhancement or advanced technology or superior tactics. It was the simple human capacity to choose connection over isolation, understanding over fear, and hope over despair. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to make that choice. It just took a genetically enhanced super soldier, a pragmatic engineer, and a conflicted spy to show everyone else that it was possible. 2 years after the Galactic Mediator Syndicate's founding, the diplomatic corps of the Inner Worlds held its first tri-species unity celebration. The event was hosted aboard the neutral station, Harmony Point, a massive structure built specifically for interspecies diplomacy. Representatives from dozens of worlds gathered to witness something that had never happened before in recorded galactic history. Commander Serah stood at the center of the main reception hall, wearing not her old military uniform, but the distinctive deep blue of the Mediator Syndicate. To her left stood Eli Torres, whose engineering innovations had helped design the very station they were standing on. To her right stood Kai Navarro, whose intelligence networks now serve peace-building efforts across 12 sectors. The Kytherian ambassador approached them first, her expression carefully neutral. Commander Serah, or should I say Director Serah now? Just Serah will do fine, Ambassador Chen. There was no hostility in her voice, just the quiet confidence of someone who'd found her true purpose. Thank you for attending today's ceremony. The War Council wanted me to extend an official invitation. They'd like to discuss terms for your return to Kytherian service. Serah smiled, an expression that would have been impossible during her military days. Please tell the War Council that I'm exactly where I belong. But if they'd like to discuss how enhanced soldiers might be better served by organizations that value their humanity, I'm always available for that conversation. The Terran intelligence director was next approaching Kai with the kind of careful respect reserved for dangerous unknowns. Lieutenant Navarro, your old department has some questions about classified information that may have been compromised. Kai's response was polite but firm. Director Walsh, I'm happy to discuss anything that doesn't compromise ongoing peace operations. But I should mention that most of my former colleagues already know where to find me if they're interested in more meaningful work. The real moment came when the Andromedan Coalition's Prime Minister approached all three of them together. The Coalition wishes to formally recognize the Terran, Kytherian, Andromedan Mining Rights Accord. This agreement represents the first successful tri-species resource sharing pact in galactic history. What made the moment historic wasn't just the agreement itself, but how it had been achieved. Traditional diplomacy had failed for over a decade. Military intervention had only made the conflicts worse. It had taken the Mediator Syndicate's unique approach, combining tactical thinking engineering solutions and intelligence coordination to find a path forward that all three species could accept. More importantly, the Prime Minister continued, this agreement was negotiated and implemented by the first tri-species leadership team in recorded history, a genetically enhanced Kytherian commander, a human engineer, and a Terran intelligence operative, working as equals rather than representatives of competing interests. The applause that followed wasn't just polite diplomatic acknowledgement, it was genuine appreciation for something unprecedented. For the first time in galactic history, military force engineering innovation and intelligence gathering had been used not to gain advantage over others, but to create benefits for everyone involved. As the formal ceremony concluded, the three of them found themselves on the station's observation deck, looking out at the stars through the massive transparent aluminum windows. Ships from dozens of worlds hung in space around them, their running lights creating a constellation of peaceful cooperation. Sometimes I can't believe this is real, Eli said, watching a Kytherian transport dock peacefully alongside a Terran research vessel. 2 years ago, I was a weapon pointed at targets I'd never chosen, Serah reflected. Now I'm part of something that builds instead of destroys. It still feels impossible some days. The intelligence reports are starting to show the ripple effects. The effects, Kai added. Other military units are adopting our organizational structure. Intelligence agencies are shifting resources toward cooperation instead of espionage. Engineering consortiums are focusing on projects that benefit multiple species. Serah turned to look at both of them, these two men who'd transformed her from a lonely super soldier into part of something larger than herself. You know what the most interesting part is? We're not unique. There are enhanced soldiers throughout the galaxy who want to build instead of destroy. Intelligence operatives who want to serve truth instead of political convenience. Engineers who want to solve problems instead of just maintaining weapons. They were just waiting for someone to show them it was possible, Eli said. We were all waiting, Kai corrected, waiting for permission to be more than what we were designed to be. As they stood there together, watching the peaceful dance of starships from across the galaxy, Serah realized that her genetic enhancements had given her something she'd never expected. Not just the ability to be a perfect soldier, but the capacity to become something entirely new. The universe had spent millennia teaching its inhabitants to fear the unknown, to compete for resources, to view differences as threats to be eliminated. But here in this moment, surrounded by beings from dozens of worlds working together, she could see a different possibility. "You know what I've learned," she said, putting her hands on both men's shoulders. "Strength isn't about being formidable enough to stand alone. Real strength is about being brave enough to stand together." Eli grinned. "Even when the odds are impossible." "Especially when the odds are impossible," Kai added. "That's when cooperation matters most." The three of them stood there as the station's lighting shifted to simulate evening on a dozen different worlds simultaneously. Around them, the galaxy continued its ancient dance of conflict and cooperation, fear and hope, isolation and connection. But for the first time in recorded history, connection was winning. The woman who had once been too formidable for her own kind had discovered something that her genetic designers never could have anticipated. The most powerful force in the universe wasn't superior weapons or advanced technology or enhanced capabilities. It was the simple revolutionary act of choosing to trust each other. And in a galaxy full of beings who had forgotten what that felt like, three unlikely friends were teaching everyone else how to remember. Stronger together, against all odds. That was their promise to each other and to the universe that had brought them together. And as the stars wheeled overhead, that promise felt like the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't what you're built to be, but who you choose to become. If you enjoyed Commander Serah's journey from isolation to connection, hit that subscribe button for more epic sci-fi stories where humanity's greatest power isn't technology or genetics, but the courage to stand together. What alien civilization will we encounter next? Subscribe to find out.